All right, well, you probably all know that I'm going to tell you to turn off your phone. All right. Wisdom Wednesday. ALI members and guests are invited to attend right here on this stage from 2:30 to 4. The presentation will be Poets of the Piano, Phantasmagoria with Nathan Carteret. Now, some of you might think of when you hear Phantasmagoria of something scary and bad, but in this case, I'm sure Phantasmagoria means images created in a dreamlike state in the mind by beautiful music. Of course, if I was playing the piano, it would be scary and bad. But also, and today on a very serious note, I want to draw everyone's attention to Tiger Giving Day. For those of you that donated last year, we much appreciate your donation. You can see that part of your donation is pictured on there with the rocking chairs up on the Sunny Slope porch. This year, what we're looking to do is we're looking to get donations that will enhance our classroom capabilities, screens, projectors, audio equipment so people will be able to hear better, and of course, some computers. So please, if you feel like and if you would be so kind as to donate for Tiger Giving Day, that would be greatly appreciated. And of course, that is this Thursday, the 21st. ALI Game Night, that is Thursday the 28th. That's next week, Thursday. We're going to have board games and fun. Ursula will be providing some nice goodies, and it should be a nice time for everybody. So let's plan on that. And then something that's, I think, is good outside, if you haven't noticed, there are spring course samplers, so you can see what courses are available for this spring session. We have some really great courses lined up. Of course, there will be a continuation of this fine course with Dr. Kicklighter. Well, speaking of that, how did you guess? Speaking of that, well, you know, it's really, people have this opinion of the Middle Ages, that it was like this dark period with no intellectual thought, and that Europe somehow went into this 1,000-year slumber of intellectual capability. Well, nothing really could be further from the truth. For example, in 1107, when the central tower of the Winchester Cathedral collapsed, some people felt that this was due to the fact that the blasphemous King William II was buried there, and so that was God's own punishment. But indeed, other people felt that probably, regardless of whom had been buried there, it probably was just faulty construction that caused the tower to collapse. Well, now it is my pleasure to introduce a man whose lectures are never faulty, regardless of whom he buries verbally. Dr. Joseph Kicklighter.
Yes. Again, he just keeps you hanging until that last end. Thank you, Frank. I wish we could continue the merriment, but it's no longer a happy subject. We're talking about violence, fist fights, yes, and a lot of people who are here today are part of it. There's gang warfare. Now, you say, not academics. Yes. We are fairly violent people. And here you have what's going on. You bring up the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Pow, wham. And can you imagine at a conference, if you've had too much joy juice and then somebody uses those words, my period was more important than yours. Yeah, you think it would just be gripes and pouts, but no, no. These people take it seriously. And what we are going to do is show why my people are right and they're wrong. And if others have an argument, they can talk about it during the break of 4.5 minutes, okay? seriously, in the 19th century, a great Swiss historian by the name of Jacob Burckhardt proclaimed the greatness of the Italian Renaissance. And in so doing, he stirred up a hornet's nest among those people who studied earlier periods. Jacob Burckhardt is a name that most of us learn when we study the Italian Renaissance because he was, well, so much identified with the ideas of the native genius of the Italians, as we all know, and their significant accomplishments in the fine arts and in various other fields. But this idea that medievalists then are thin-skinned and take exception may or may not be true. I'm sorry I couldn't have a better photograph of him, but he was truly a magnificent figure. As Burckhardt is associated with the Italian Renaissance that we associate with so many, Michelangelo and so many others, this man, Charles Homer Haskins, I actually sat in his chair at Harvard. My body touched where his had been. And I mean, I'm just telling you, that was truly an experience for me. His personhood had been where my little, behind was, and I thought, wow. He was one of the greatest. He more or less picked up the cause of what I'm going to be discussing today, and that cause was, by the title of his own book, The Renaissance of the 12th Century. And it was all very polite and genteel, but he said, in effect, that during the 12th century, civilization in the West recovered. So thank you very much, Burckhardt and others. We're already there. And it was not a dark period devoid of civilization. That he then proceeded to point out in a variety of fields, not just literature, but architecture, education, the papacy, the church, the monarchies, government, the Crusades, for goodness sakes. All of these he considered aspects of a recovery of Europe that has been, I suppose, continued to be evaluated and considered by scholars ever since. Population growth, more towns and cities, on and on you go. Of course, part of this has to do with what you mean by a Renaissance and how you want to date it. Since the days of Haskins, and you could see up there that he was actually an advisor to Woodrow Wilson, the Woodrow Wilson, yes, of World War I fame. He was chosen by Wilson as an advisor on ethnic minorities, which I think is absolutely fascinating. You think, what's a medievalist doing there? Well, because the guy was extremely brilliant, and I suppose that when Wilson was going to get over there to Paris, he well knew that those folks, and they did, were all going to begin to squabble, and say, no, that's ours, this is ours, it's like the Poles and the Serbs and the various groups, the Czechs. Yeah. You thought I wasn't going to mention. But yeah, Yeah, I was thinking, but all these groups are blah, 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 blah. And then this great medievalist from Harvard stands up and says, let me get all this straight here. In the such and such century, and the theory was everybody was going to go, gosh, you mean Charles Homer Haskins? Well, then that settles the issue then. Didn't work out that way, but I'm sure he had a nice trip to Paris out of it. He should have been staying, if you ask me, right there at the Widener Library in Cambridge and writing another book because he was very good at that. The Renaissance of the 12th century is merely his most famous. I mean, if you were to ask anybody, they would know that one. But there were also many books on everything you wanted to know about Normans but were afraid to ask. You know, like Normandy itself, Norman England, Norman Sicily. He wrote The Rise of the Universities, which is sort of like a way to get started on your study of the universities, and many other topics. He was, of course, the kind of proponent of the Middle Ages, because the idea here is that probably he starts the ball rolling in terms of more and more people wanting to study this period, if you want to know the truth. More PhDs, more people going into it professionally, and so forth. All of this is merely an introduction to our study here and to make sure that you're aware of how he was fascinated by the period. Now, he loved the Normans, and that's not surprising, being an expert on English history and French history and so forth and so on, because the Normans were part of England, France, and Sicily, Italy. So everywhere, Crusades, wherever you might, the Norman Conquest, wherever you go, there are the Normans, if you are a medievalist. So there he was in terms of his studies. And of course, if we want to use the dreadful F word, feudalism, he's right there, because remember, it all starts in Normandy. In other words, I think that as we study this Renaissance of the 12th century, if we want to keep it in the 12th century, we can go back into the 11th. You remember we talked about Gregory VII, the great pope, and how all of that played out. And there are other aspects, the Norman conquest of England and so forth and so on, to understand what he did. But today I thought we could look primarily at the universities and some particular intellectual issues that kept them up at night. And this, of course, for most of us, would not disturb our slumber. Believe me, but it does in their case. We know about some of the great universities, and I wanted to give equal time here to the Empire and England. And I just tell you, I know many of you have been to Heidelberg. It is just, I don't want to say, I mean, it's just a beautiful place to be. I went there many, many years ago, and I'm sure it's just the same today. But it was, or is, one of the oldest universities in the West as a center of intellectual attraction. Many of us don't know how these universities came to be. Now, I can assure you, having been to Oxford a gazillion times, it did not look like that in the Middle Ages. I've pointed that out to students repeatedly. because you say, gosh, it's just as beautiful as a postcard. Yes, that's great. The Oxford Chamber of Commerce is there, right? They've got all we need. But we understand that all of this was built up to appear medieval. Yeah, no, downer. But it's like, if you want to play medieval, that's a great place to do it. But you understand that things were not so glamorous as they are today. And of course, Oxford, now some Cambridge people will disagree with me, but I think Oxford is pretty beautiful. It's very beautiful to me. In any event, these are two of the most famous. And we understand that their evolution into university status took a long time. They didn't just set up. It was an evolving process. And I always like to point out that you got to start with schools before you can have universities. And this means basic schools. We call them monastic schools. You say, well, what about public schools? No public schools. We are essentially having schools to teach the monks and others how to read and write so they can do the Mass and carry out other religious responsibilities. If you are a layman, I don't really think you need apply. It's not that there's anything against lay people studying, there's just no point. I mean, you got to earn a living. You got stuff to do. Monastic schools, then, are thought to be usually rural places, isolated, and essentially dedicated to teaching those who need fundamental education. Notice I said those who need it, because they've got things to do. They've got to carry out church services if they are going to be what we call secular clergy. And otherwise, if you're going to be a monk, well, of course, you got to read, because you got to read the saints' lives, you've got to study. That's part of being in the church, so to speak. So we understand that, and what happens in this Renaissance, of course, is the spread of education from monastic schools to what we call cathedral schools. Cathedral schools, that is, schools that are in the bishop's educational facilities, are going to come about a bit later and are pretty much an example of what happens as population grows, as does urban living, commercial activities. And again, no one back then presumably could dream of public schools or coeducational schools or any of the rest. This is the idea of now we are going to have education centered in places of larger population and also places that are not isolated. So cathedral schools will be the kind of seed for the universities, which is interesting, but we do understand as we get there, the schools are kind of basic, and yet there's a lot going on that will lead to the desire for more advanced education. Like I say, at first learning is practical, but as the schools get more and more advanced, in terms of what's known, people are going to want to talk about other aspects. Well, if this is true, let's take it up a notch. And you say, I think that's troubling. You are mighty right. I would just keep moving back from what you're getting into, because there's going to be trouble. And you can bet there will be. But as I say, the cathedral schools are the appropriate place for this to be going on. We got these educational centers. Presumably, we are going to have individuals who are going to want to learn as much as possible and who will want to make inquiries. As they say, inquiring minds want to know, right? So that's the purpose of education, not merely rote learning. I think there was probably a lot of rote learning in the monastic schools, but who's to really know those things? It's simply, it's hard to imagine that when they are teaching each matter that they have to learn, like the sacraments and the various other aspects of the fundamental Catholic belief system, and the saints' lives, whatever it is, that they would want to say, well, what does that mean? And what's that symbol? Dop, dop, dop. You know, it's like school. It's like, you know, if somebody actually were to, in school, you know, somebody raise a hand and say, could we go into greater depth on that point, ma'am? That was bad. Wouldn't you be overjoyed? Oh, blessed are you. You would want to canonize this little imp. You know, you would say, oh, venerable one. Yeah, I know. It's like your heart beats faster with excitement. And it's so, but I don't mean to get any of you teachers excited, because it isn't happening. They're going to say, do we have to know that? So, yeah. So let's not get out of control here. So they have that, and what I guess in today's terms would be the core curriculum will be the 7 basic studies that we are going to go over, that apparently would be what I guess in today's terms, again, we'd say undergraduate learning, the basic studies, the humanities. And I found this interesting illustration of a kind of orbit of learning of the humanities and the sciences, and you will notice grammar, speech or rhetoric, and dialectic and logic. And you could see that the trivium would include our beloved history as part of that, as you can imagine. You say, I mean, history's part of everything, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, you can't really escape it, but I don't need to. It's not like you can narrow us down just to one field. We're everywhere. We're so don't, yeah, you think, how could you do logic without history? How could you do speech? How could you do everything? Yeah, it's there. The quadrivium is rather interesting, I think, when you think of music and you think of its mathematical qualities. You will understand that arithmetic and geometry definitely follow, along with astronomy there. You may wonder, where's your physics or where's your biology and all the rest? And I think it's probably, again, a question of they're not that informed about the mass of Aristotle's works. This is the basic, and this is what they have sort of inherited, and this is what they teach at what we would call the primary level. as they began. We'll go into that in a moment. But just to be familiar about what they considered to be essential before you could go higher. Now, as far as what they knew from the past, mostly this would come, of course, from Greek sources. There would be Roman as well, but I'm thinking, of course, of Aristotle so often. And always we have to be careful, very careful, because we understand some of these sources, they're not rated X, but they're rated R. And the reason we have to rate them that way is they are, I'm going to use the P word, pagan. Yes. I know. And so, if you get it in the unexpurgated edition, you ask yourself, are we really ready to let kids use this? These versions of the literature, it's amazing when you think about it. If we teach it the right way, then it's okay. But we need to watch them, we need to explain. Now, before we get into this lesson, you need to understand the writer was pagan. And the kids look kind of scared, nervous. Is it really all right for us to look at it? It's okay. But let me explain first. That kind of thing, you need a little guidance there. The Almagest by Ptolemy will be a very important work. He was a major Greek astronomer of the 3rd century after Christ, Egyptian. Well, he was living in Egypt. He was Greek. And you can imagine Midtown Alexandria for sure. I mean, he was not, he was astronomer, for goodness sakes. He was following various Hellenistic ideas, and of course they included the geocentric theories that the earth is the center of the world. And so he had a variety of writings to prove that to be true. And they began to study it. I suppose that it started coming in Latin versions. Because otherwise, let's face it, there weren't a whole lot of people yet who could read Greek. So they needed versions which sometimes went from, you won't believe this, Greek to Arabic to Latin. Have you ever heard that expression, something got lost in translation? You ever heard that? And it really did. It's amazing to me the phenomenal minds of people who could go through all these different language stages. And remember, you can't just, as you say in my day, Xerox off a copy. Remember, call in your Benedictines, and some poor soul, for his sins, he will do another copy. Yeah, you say, yeah, atonement. I've heard some things about your record. Maybe you could make another copy. He said, oh, I'll be glad to, Father. That's the way it is. Euclid's geometry. Now, if you are a mathematician, you say, God, it's just titillating even to think about Euclidean geometry. If you are, a parallelogram's pretty titillating for you. Yeah, see, I saw that glint in your eye. Remember how it could be bisected into 2 right triangles? That brings back the way we were. Ooh, yeah, that's pretty darn good, isn't it? And all of these works, and you'd say, gosh, you mean in addition to hagiography, we're going to have this? I want to go back to school. Yes, you can do saints' lives. But we also have some works. But promise you won't get excited by people like Euclid and other too much, because they're still pagans. I know, and you say, how dangerous and corrupt could it be to do pagan mathematicians' work? Not very. But it could be exciting if you really get turned on by playing geometry. And I'm proud to know you. You are a paragon of mathematical virtue. And God love you. I'm happy to know you. But understand, again, that these works are gradually coming into the knowledge of scholars. Now, does that involve most of the people in medieval Europe? No! Most folks have to work and reproduce and things like that. They are not busy with this. These folks, A, are not reproducing. They are essentially scholars. And it is a very small group, as far as I am aware, within society. And I think that always needs to be borne in mind. These cathedral schools, as the knowledge of the classics, the Greeks, the Romans, the early Christians, as their body of teachings, their works become available, they will then become the basis for scholars to form what are known as universities. People often think that the word university has to do with large schools, but truly the word university comes from the teachers and students. Many of you already know that. A university essentially was an assembly of students who formed together to determine their rights, their responsibilities, I guess. And the teachers did the same. In other words, it was a teacher's university and there was a student's university. And presumably they negotiated about their coursework and what they had to do, and the same as far as the teachers were concerned. That is to say, how could they be sure they were going to get their tuition worth from those teachers? It's fascinating to read these things because they are in many ways a kind of academic contract. I mean, we have the syllabus today, but the students themselves understood that they needed their rights enforced. And, you know, if they had some sorry teacher who took off and said, you know, I'm not going to have class, well, you would demand a refund. I mean, wouldn't you be furious if I called off class or I decided to give 15-minute breaks? You would demand a refund, an early refund, and I wouldn't get my raise this time. You see, this is the kind of thing, I mean, we can't allow this. We have to have strict standards. So you got to hold people. And so that's what happened. These people drifted, so it said, into these cathedral towns. They set themselves up as teachers, and the students approached them in the higher learning, they called it, like philosophy and theology. There was some medicine studies, largely in northern Italy. There were great legal studies, also largely in northern Italy. But the universities were primarily known for the studies of philosophy and theology. And some of you are going to say, well, I couldn't get enough of that anyway. I mean, is there any end? No, there is no end. Inquiring minds want to know more and more about theology and philosophy, but particularly the Queen of Science's theology. And you say, but I thought science was in that, you know, the white lab coat, the Bunsen burner, and all the rest. But the word science, as they originally had it, as we all know from our Latin studies, scientia, knowledge, is essentially what it means. So, as they used the term, theology was the highest form of learning. And it becomes, not surprisingly, more and more complex as time goes on. And again, as they learn more and more. However, not surprisingly to us, the law provides the most job opportunities, so that too becomes very important. And that law, by the way, can mean either traditional law as Roman law, or it can mean the law of the church. Lots of jobs in there. No surprise. I think they call it the canon law, as I'm sure you Catholics are aware. And boy, oh boy, plenty of folks are getting jobs there. I mean, men and women nowadays. But these particular schools are training people, and I'll use that word train, because again, you are entering a profession. You are and you are going to wherever the people who have the big names. It's sort of like if you were a lad, say, in the 1930s, and you were thinking about going to study the Middle Ages. So you're looking for a Norman person. Well, now we just go online, wouldn't we, and use some kind of academic service. But back in that day, you would find out Haskins was at Harvard and said, boy, I need to go to Massachusetts. Cambridge will bust. Because that's the way you went, not, I mean, we love Harvard, Cambridge is nice and all this, that, and the other, but it's Haskins. I just want to be near him. I want to be a Haskins groupie, you know, that kind of thing. It's just, and you'd say, oh my God, just think, every day we could talk about Normans. Oh God, the First and Second Crusade. Yeah, exactly. And then you can imagine, and Haskins has to gently say to some, you need to go back home. I know, it hurts. But then you go somewhere else for medieval studies, and it's pretty crushing, but if you want to stay. But I was hoping to do a PhD in medieval, and they said, well, maybe there's a program at a local school where you're from. Yeah, it hurts. But that happens. I mean, that's academia for you. I promise you, that's just reality. The cathedrals can be like this one. And again, this is part of the great accomplishment of this era, although it went on. And yes, sometimes there were mechanical issues involving in cathedral building. However, you got to give it to them, considering the period and the knowledge of engineering. The constructions of these great edifices are certainly indicative of hard work and great faith. Like many programs, I'm sure they had people who were in advancement so that they could raise the necessary funds, because these were not built without great expenditure. And you say, who had that kind of money? Well, this had to be done gradually and by both religious and lay funds. And you know, when you go to a place like Durham and see this magnificent edifice, because the first thing I thought was, Boy, I bet those Catholics are mad. Because, of course, this has been Anglican since the 16th century. As you know, Henry VIII seized all of this, and that made it Church of England. And said, well, if you Catholics want to have a nice church, maybe you could build one of your own. Yeah, but I still believe Loyola and Calvin are hugging, but in a better place. But if you go to Durham, which is, of course, a very working class, miners' town, this is an incredible edifice. Let's face it, it's probably mostly a tourist site now, but it is, strictly speaking, a house of worship, and yet representing a great symbol of this medieval Renaissance that was going on in the period. I thought Wales was mighty beautiful. If you've been down south, you know, this is south of London. I mean, just the way Durham is way up north, this is way down south. And like Bath and Wells. And I just thought this was the epitome of this Gothic style of architecture. And again, I could have shown lots of other examples. I just thought that since we were talking about cathedral schools and cathedrals as symbols of this Renaissance period, I thought it's interesting how the styles could be so different in two different locations. I mean, it was nothing personal. It was simply the fact that, to me, Wales is so very beautiful. You could go to Salisbury, which you know is down south, and it's also very beautiful and an example of Gothic architecture, you know, with the great windows and all the rest of it. In this connection, of course, I'm trying to think of education, however, and who is involved in the education. People who want to be in the clergy or who look forward to some sort of career that requires learning. This normally would involve then cathedrals, and I can imagine how large the staff would have been. Not just the scholars, I imagine the canons of the cathedral would have had some role there, but whatever style it may have been, and I'm sure most of them were not as grand as Wells and Durham were, but those I thought were two examples of, you know, Romanesque and Gothic, and I thought they were just very beautiful. The type of teaching that went on is sometimes illustrated by the just drawings that have been done of what students and teachers did. Now, first of all, it's important to understand that it started with one-on-one learning, which of course is wonderful if you have that luxury. Many of us do not, but we understand also the idea of the free-floating mass lecture class would have been unheard of, A, because there weren't that many people who were in the classroom, and B, because the complexity of the material they were studying would not have allowed it. Let me get specific. As the teachers are offering what they're offering, the students have to make up their minds whether they want to learn with that person. And then the person tells them how much it's going to cost. And when you are setting up the arrangements, because it's not going to be one-on-one, but they promise you that when you finish, you are going to know this legal code backward and forward. And you're going to, wow, man, you know it that well. Indeed I do. You want Justinian's law code? This is the place to do it. And you say, well, gosh, it must have been very scintillating to attend those classes. Oh, I don't think so. I think you sit and you listen. You know what a lecture means? Well, of course we do. From the verb, I read, you read, he, she, it reads. And you say, that doesn't sound very scintillating. Oh, the thought of Justinian's law code is not scintillating? Yeah, hour after hour. And we're not talking about taking breaks. Oh, no. We're talking about the excitement. Ergo, we see the students. I thought this was very interesting. Some are standing, and I suppose the ones who are standing do not have access to their own books. Could you imagine being fortunate enough, if you're a scholarship student, you might be just trying to read from the copy the one in front has. And you think, that one in the middle, he's a big old faker. I've had many of them. They will sit there and say, I was just resting my eyes. Oh, God, I believe that. Not for a minute. You loathe someone. Yes, I've seen it. I've seen them do it and lie to my face. Yeah, that's the truth. So, yeah, you look at him and sort of feigning interest, but they will be found out. Oh, yes. The arms of Morphus. They are there. So all of this then, I think, illustrates what they're doing. Right there, you got the code in front of you, and the professor goes through and reads it, and then the professor gives his commentary on that portion of the code. And you could say, gosh, could we start that? And I mean, that's what class was like. Hour after hour, learning. But not, I mean, they don't have to worry. If you don't like it, you can leave, you know? It's like, this is what you have, and this is what would be provided. And as it evolves, this is going to lead to some sort of recognition that you have done these classes. And of course, we know them as degrees, like commencement when you do the whole curriculum. But you can imagine how complicated all of this gets. This takes lots of time and bureaucrats and all the rest. But in the early stages, we understand how really simple it is. You simply take the classes you think you're going to need, and whether it's interesting or not, they presumably will provide you with some understanding of these issues. Now, if you were going to do canon law, oh gosh, could you imagine all these exciting, on the legal aspects of the sacraments? You say, oh, I'm already titillated. Stop it. Okay. I won't go on to more, but that's just to get you sort of excited and understand if you were doing a theology or canon law degree, what you would have to look forward to. You get up every morning and say, oh boy, today it's more confirmation lectures, you know, that kind of thing. So there's just no end to the fun university students had, although there may have been another side to university life. And speaking of which, We'll get to that after the break. Okay, 4.5. Okay, 4.5. Let us proceed by noticing this next picture, which I think shows you even more what the classroom would have been like. While I don't think we can appreciate what hairstyles and clothing would have been like, we can get a sense of what it must have been like to have been a student. Because again, I love the idea of the professor being up there, yes. And you see that knave on the side taking a nap. Oh, the indignity, banish him. He should be put out of the Catholic Church for that, right? What's that? Yes. Because, well, you see them, I mean, and people talking, engaging in perhaps secular conversation. It's the devil's work, yes. There's sloth involved there. But again, if you are a great authority, a great academic, and you're casting all these pearls of wisdom, you're bound to run into one who is not worthy. And you don't have to worry about ratemyprofessor.com. So there's no issues of that sort. Again, what was interesting to me was how did the church officials know what was going on in these classroom situations. But as rumors got around, we know there must have been a snitch in the class who could tell the authorities if there was something that, dare I use the word, subversive, being taught. I mean, I don't think anybody was an out-and-out heretic, but you might have thought, you might have said, well, you might consider this point of view, and some little snitch would then, during break, probably run to tell the authorities. Whatever the case, the church, who after all, let's hear it for the Catholic Church, they were funding all of this. They are providing what educational facilities there are. Which is to say, then they thought they had a right somehow to manage what was being taught and make sure that it was appropriate. And that means, as you see, following the correct views. Yes, sir?
Are some of those women?
If you look like it, they wouldn't be, would they? They'd be all
No, co-education.
I know, but look at them.
Welcome back to the 20th century.
The guys are sleeping right in front of them, too, that look like they're definitely women. Like that guy was looking at us like a
Unless they are simply going to a church service, but it wouldn't be a classroom setting because there was no co-education.
And then that one on the end was...
There would have to be then some sort of special church service. But even then, it would be very odd, wouldn't it? Because most of their lives were... he's a clergy, for goodness sakes. You're not thinking, oh, wow, we want to meet some chicks. I can't imagine. Wouldn't that be distracting from Aristotle or not? Yeah. So, yeah, but that's interesting. It does look like possibility. And see that poor soul, he is just knocked down. So if it was church, it must have been a terrible sermon. Or he was sort of depressed about his spiritual life. I don't know, but I just like the idea of he seems to be sitting, doesn't he? And so I'm thinking, if I had hours to lecture, hours, I would want to have a class full of people with great kidneys and that would just love to listen to passage after passage of Justinian or Thomas Aquinas, and they would keep, this is a fantasy, and keep saying, go on and on, don't stop. But it doesn't happen that way. The teaching annals would not be complete in the Middle Ages without reference to perhaps the greatest teacher of the medieval universities, a man named Peter Abelard in English. Of course, he was French, but he's known to us as Peter Abelard. And what makes him, in part, so famous is because he actually wrote an autobiography of sorts, which is unusual. And I've always said someone who writes an autobiography has got to have an enormous ego to think that his life is that important. And boy, he thought his was. He really thought he was hot stuff. And no question, every page just drips of me, 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 me. He was, however, a monk, a teacher, a part of the church, very involved. He died in the monastic life, so we understand that. But important for our discussion is the fact that he wrote a work called Sic et Non, Yes and No, in which he brought up passages from Scripture or other church writings that seemed to be in contradiction. And he did not try to put them together. He just let them sit there. And yes, somebody made copy after copy of these works. And you think, well, that must have been interesting, I guess. But, I mean, it gives you a nice pastime, and you feel like you're helping people. But by not coordinating them, some people would say he was creating a little bit of controversy. At the same time, of course, he did have troubles. And that was the history of my calamities, which you can still read today with great interest. Now, I think it's interesting to see why some in the church didn't trust him. By doubting we come to inquiry, and through inquiry we perceive truth. Well, all that's nice to say in a liberal environment such as ours, but in the more closed-minded atmosphere of academia in the 12th, 13th centuries, I'm not so sure we were quite prepared for a kind of Jesuit attitude. No offense. Yeah, so that's Abelard, because he's just saying, let it out. Let's just talk it all out and see. And you can mention those bishops and other great church leaders saying, I don't know about this fella. He's kind of trouble. Well, he was trouble in many ways. Here is an example. The famous Eloise. Yes? Chastity, chastity, chastity. We always wonder, how can we maintain it? Because we want our people to practice celibacy. And that does seem to be, I know, that seems to be troubling, doesn't it? Eloise, now again, our source is Abelard, so you understand that, but in his story, he commits what today, I guess, we would call sexual harassment. Have you ever thought about that? He was the He was the teacher of Eloise. He was the older teacher of Eloise. Because, you know, it always sounds so romantic when we tell the story now, but in today's world, it's a whole nother story. That is her uncle in the back. Yeah. And saying, I don't believe this is connected to Cicero, is it? Or any of the subjunctive.
Looks consensual.
Well, I'm not so sure, though. Again, the uncle's going to appreciate what's going on. No. And the affair, the birth of Astrolabe, that was the baby because they thought that was so cool, you know. A name like, you know, we're in science, that's the vogue. And then the permanent scarring of Abelard that followed. Again, stories that are told in the history of my calamities. Presumably, as we would say in days of yore, ruffians hired by her uncle disfigured him. So yes, they fixed him. So he that wouldn't be an issue anymore. How he lived through that is something I try not to ponder. Okay? I just move on. Just move on. That's the best way. Just keep going. We're going to keep going. Yeah. But it ended the relationship. Yeah. They could just be good friends. And say, let's just keep studying and so forth. And it's very interesting to read the letters of Abelard and Eloise because as she becomes herself an abbess and he proceeds to the monastic life, she will write to him in ways that will seem like she never got over him. And he will write back and say, now, sister, which is kind of a brush off. Now, sister, you need to keep your religious duties in mind and all of that. It's a very interesting relationship that will continue as you read the letters, that her love for him never ended, but he went on, of course, to be a celebrated, if controversial, scholar, albeit a victim somewhat of a very, very irate uncle who felt, rightly I guess, that he had betrayed the trust put upon him, whether consensual or not. Yes? So that's an interesting little sidelight. You think, how often do you think that happened? Who knows? This became one of the most celebrated incidents in medieval history, I guess. I've never heard of such a thing before. But you know there had to be similar incidents. However, there are not that many Eloise and Abelards. I mean, Eloise herself was a great writer and thinker and so forth. Had she been a man, I'm sure she too would have had a great career. But when you read those letters, it is absolutely amazing to think what remarkable individuals they were. Now, obviously, let me share with you, and I got these from Charles Homer Haskins, letters between parents and students. This is to inform you I'm studying at Oxford with the greatest diligence, but the matter of money stands greatly. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? It's always the way. The city is expensive and makes many demands. We know that, those kind of demands, don't we? Six-packs? Parking. I have to rent lodgings, buy necessaries, and provide for many other things which I cannot specify. Whereby I respectfully beg your paternity that by the promptings of divine pity you may assist me. Yeah, it's called buttering them up, right? It is interesting, though, the tone and calling your father the venerable master. That's just that great touch, you know. You are so wonderful. You're so great. Yes, send money. And now the Father. It is written, he also that is slothful in his work is brother to him who is a great waster. I have recently discovered you live dissolutely and slothfully, preferring license to restraint and play to work and strumming a guitar while the others are at their studies. I know these people, yes. I mean, you know, yeah, I didn't mean, I guess I got behind and some of them are reading, you know, that kind of bums. And notice it says, and your more industrious commands have read several volumes. In other words, these are the ones you want in your class. These are the ones, you know, they're in the library working. And others, because I've seen these people, like on Friday afternoon, people who headed for Ralph Brown's Wrong. My kind of little, yeah, saintly types. But others, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was trying to figure out what the P was.
The P, oh,
Or
that,
P.
they don't know what the name is, see? So the person who transcribed these just put P. Could be Petrus or...
Well, it says residing at Orleans.
They know the name of the town. Oh, no. The P goes with yes, the other place. The other place. But those are simply the initials, simply, okay, great. That's right. So, yeah, that just makes it, but it shows you, in other words, a sort of how some would have really spoken about it. And remember, there were lots and lots of letters like this. Haskins published a whole volume of them. Letters, I just thought these are two that I've always found the most amusing because they do represent feelings. Because remember, like going away to school at any time, except these individuals were particular in that they were supposed to be going because they were church people. They had a very great purpose, and they were not there to strum guitars or meet some sort, but they did. And we have town and so-called town and gown issues. We have letters like that where local females were involved with students, and that ends up in incidents. And of course, you can imagine individuals like that who were supposed to be practicing chastity, and they were holy orders. This can be, you know, you go for a disciplinary committee, and there are people who deal with. And also there can be community people who then get all over them. So there are all kind of interesting incidents, as one can imagine, occurring at any time, not just then. But my favorite, of course, is what they are doing in the classroom. And that means Aristotle and Christianity. How can we bring it all together? How do we know that what we accept as true by virtue of our own experience, or what is taught to us by logic, how do we know that it is compatible with what the church teaches? Reason versus revelation. A problem for various scholars. It had been a problem over the centuries. You have early Christian converts who themselves were scholars. And some of them just throw it all out and say, don't need it anymore. You know, I got the New Testament. I've got Jesus. And then you have others who say, like Justin Martyr, who said, you know, the pagans knew as much truth as they had up to that point. Yeah, exactly. And so, good pagan.
Yeah.
And so, because you followed the truth that you could. And so we love you for that. Too bad you couldn't be with us and get the whole story. But that isn't your fault. No, that isn't your fault. No. We don't condemn them. We love them. So, that worked for them. But as time moved on, more and more Aristotelian works. And if you were an Aristotle person, you say, I can't get enough. And you probably want the whole thing, like a whole collection. Because we could arrange that arriving in your Amazon by tomorrow. The greatest hits of Aristotle. Or you'd want the whole thing, not just hits. Because we got big, little, I mean, the whole Aristotelian corpus, which only a philosopher could love. You can imagine how that is to fit in all of that. Physics. Oh my God, logic. I mean, how many different areas of thought is Aristotle involved in? Political science, drama. I have to control myself. That's enough. Let's let it go at that. But all of these translated from Greek, maybe to Arabic. Who knows, maybe into Hebraic languages. And then finally into Latin. And we love it so, don't we? I know. I get the same way. But poor Westerners, we just have to, we don't know all those other things. And so all of this, in whatever version they get a hold of and they pour over it. And who is they? These scholars in the West. Remember, they're all professors. So this is what they're supposed to be doing, right? And at first, the church leaders, heads of the orders, are saying, oh, this is great. Y'all keep going. Keep doing it. And that's fine for a while. Perfect example is someone we do know and love, St. Anselm, one of the greatest of all the archbishops of Canterbury, and you mentioned William II. And he may be burning in hell right now. But maybe not. Maybe this man reached out and saved him. Anselm, who was actually appointed archbishop by William II, was in fact a part-time philosopher theologian when he was given time from administrative responsibilities. Some people are really smart, aren't they? And this one was an amazing individual, being able to use logic to try to prove theological truths. And you want to do cur deus homo, why did God become man? Don't get on a bed. Don't get in a lazy boy, okay? Because that's offensive. To go to sleep while you're reading St. Anselm. See, those are serious offenses. And because he's trying to think, how can I help William II? He's such a loser. How can I make him a better king? The man was always, that's why he's a saint, right? So, but the idea for us is how he believed that logic could be used to prove some truths of Christianity. What do you do if you can't prove it? Accept it. Because we all know it's true anyway. He did say that. I mean, it's not He said, this is not Christianity for atheists. This is Christianity for Christians. We already believe it, but I can prove why God became man. Why was there an incarnation? I can prove it logically. If you promise not to get in a lazy boy, you can read my copy. Okay, but you have to sit up straight and maybe have a latte while you're reading it, because this is some stiff reading. This is not for cowards, okay? This is hard theological stuff. But I just think he's sort of a pioneer in the use of logic and theology. Because before that, people are just saying you just accept it. I mean, because it's divine truth. And he said, no, there are ways to use it. The man known as Averroes was a great Spanish Muslim scholar who became sensational in the West. Believe me, he didn't come there. His works did. I don't think he would have been welcome. I don't think he would have been welcome to come to France. But from Spain, his works came, and the man the Westerners called Averroes, and you'll notice he lived from early 12th century to the end of the century. And he, in fact, came out with an idea that Westerners found very comforting. People who were scholars. Now, if you had gone through the streets of Paris and said, what do you think about Averroes? I don't think folks would have said, oh, I'm not comfortable at all. Don't bring him up to it. You can understand this is all very academic. We can assume if you're there at the university in Paris, everybody's talking about the big A, and then the people probably who are cleaning up say, well, I wonder why they're so fussy about Averroes. Averroes essentially said that reason and revelation have to be compartmentalized. He'd say, but he was a Muslim. Well, that's why they got the Quran, right? And he loved Aristotle. So he said there's an Aristotelian truth and there's an Allah truth. And what do we do with them? You put them in their little pockets. Here is one truth, here's the other truth. You say, how does that work for him? Well, he liked it. But I can tell you this. Muslim authorities did not like it one little bit. And he was called in for some talks. It's a fascinating story how there in Spain, the same thing was going on. That is to say, theological dualism was unacceptable. And you can understand when this Latin Averroes said, yeah, I just can't deal with it. Man, I'm just going to be schizophrenic. This has all got to be separate. Said, is there some way there can be one truth? And yes, there was. St. Thomas Aquinas, our hero, the great Dominican, who brought it together, who taught that there can be one source of truth and one source only. His works would become the foundation for Christian teaching and still accepted, as far as I know, by the Catholic Church. And that is to say, there can be no correct difference between what we know by reason and revelation. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you next week.